Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at Rock Island with a Polytech AKS underfolder. Now, this is not the first model of AK to come into the United States, but it's one of the first, and I think it's a really good example of the story of how this ended up actually happening. So, the first AKs to come into the United States were Valmets out of Finland because, well, they weren't part of the communist bloc. It was a more accessible country for trade. And the problem was Valmets didn't quite look like the classic Sino-Soviet AKs. And so there were a lot of people interested in them who just weren't quite satisfied with the Valmet. They'd take it if that was the only thing available. And it was a fantastic quality rifle, but didn't quite fit the bill. Now, Steyr US, operating out of New Jersey, found a source for proper Soviet-looking AKs, and they found those in Egypt, having been manufactured under the name Maadi, M-A-A-D-I. And that was the first true AK to get imported into the United States as a semi-auto, and we're leaving out, of course, here, like, Vietnam War bring-back military rifles. I'm talking civilian semi-automatic AKs. The Steyr Maadi rifles were the first. Egypt had basically gotten an AK factory as a military aid gift from the Russians, and they had rifles available. And that was also a country that was a little more accessible trade-wise to the US. And when those Maadis started coming in the early, mid-1980s, the problem with them was they were really expensive. It was like $1,250, I think, for a Maadi AK. Now, they looked great. They totally fit the bill visually where the Valmets had not. But this clued in other people to the idea that, hey, there's a market for a true, proper AK, semi-auto civilian AK in the United States. And what's a good country for manufacturing things to meet US commercial desires? China. And so the next batch of guns we would see in terms of AKs into the US would be Chinese imports. And there are two primarily that kicked it off, and they would be Norinco and Polytechnologies, or Polytech. Both of these are really exporting firms. Norinco is a conglomerate of manufacturing facilities. Polytech was simply an exporter. And both of these companies would get rifles made by a number of different factories and ship them to the US. In the case of Polytech, what they had was basically a straight semi-automatic only copy of the Chinese Type 56 military rifles. Now, the first ones that came in were guns like we see here, named the AKS Semi, and those are rifles that have stamped sheet metal receivers. Polytech would also make a milled version of the Type 56 for the semi-auto market, and they called that the Legend series, and that's a separate issue that we're not going to get into in this particular video. But there were a variety of different patterns of stamped receiver Polytech AKS available for sale. So let's dig right in and take a look at the details on this one. One of the things that really set Polytech apart and made them distinctive was the use of this fixed underfolding bayonet. This is really an SKS type bayonet, and this is something unique to Chinese AKs. And with the various bands on these rifles, bayonet lugs would almost always be one of the component elements in what made a rifle difficult or impossible to import. So the fixed bayonets went away in '89 and really didn't come back. You can see this works very much just like an SKS bayonet. We've got a little spring-loaded collar there that snaps up on this lug. And then the handguard is cut out to receive the bayonet there. Several of the features distinct to the Chinese Type 56 pattern of AK are visible right up here. We have a flat muzzle nut without the slant brake on it. We have a hooded front sight. That's a distinctively Chinese feature. We have the gas tube with vent holes in it. One of the things about Chinese AKs is they tended to blend features of the Russian AK and the Russian AKM. So in Russian service, by the time you got to stamped sheet metal receivers, these vent holes had moved to the gas block instead of the gas tube here, where in Chinese production, they remained like this. The front trunnion rivets are distinctively Chinese in that they have, the front two are on a diagonal like this. Typically in other countries manufacture, the second rivet is right up here in parallel with this one. So that's a distinctive Chinese feature. The stop on the selector or on the safety lever here is distinctive to the semi-auto versions. The full auto military Type 56 does not have this stop. That is, of course, there because that's safe. The middle position is semi-auto. There we go. And then on a military rifle, the bottom position is full auto. So this, getting rid of this, by the way, does not allow the rifle to fire in full auto. It's just there so that you don't over-rotate the lever. The pistol grip is this distinctive Chinese pattern. Doesn't look all that much different, but once you get used to looking at AK items, AK elements, that's recognizably Chinese. The receiver top cover is smooth. That's something that would typically transition to a thinner gauge of metal with reinforcing ribs stamped into it. For other countries' AKMs, stamped receiver guns, the Chinese stuck with the smooth top cover the whole time. Now, this example is one of the underfolding variety. Polytech imported both fixed stocks and folding stock guns. It's worth noting that on their fixed stock guns, the stock has a substantial drop to it, which is also distinctly Chinese, but of course on the underfolder, you don't see that. Colloquially, this pattern is sometimes called a double underfolder because it's got a underfolding stock and an underfolding bayonet. Now, if we take a look at the markings here, on the back of the receiver we have Polytech Inc. out of Beijing. There were only two companies that imported guns for Polytech. One was Kang's Firearm Specialties out of Atlanta, Georgia, and the other was a company called Sile, S-I-L-E, out of New York. Then the important markings are up here. So we have model AKS 762. They actually started with the AKS 556 with a version of this same rifle in 556 because that was a caliber that was more commonly available in the US at the time. It would be largely the Chinese who started importing 762 by 39 millimeter ammunition to go with these rifles. With, for example, Valmet sales, 762 by 39 was a very uncommon option for the rifles. Most people bought them in 556 because that was the ammunition that you could actually get here in the US. By importing ammunition as well as rifles, the Chinese really made it more popular to get the 762. That was the recognizably military and historical version of the gun, and the people who wanted to be able to shoot them were much more likely to buy that recognizable pattern when they could also get the ammunition for it. Anyway, the 762 guns followed very quickly after the importation of the 556 ones. We have our manufacturer's mark here. That is a slightly or very stylized 416 in a triangle. The Chinese arsenal system uses numerical codes and has since basically the 1940s. The first digit refers to the province in which the arsenal is located. Basically, 416 is an arsenal in Shan Dong. Polytech also used Arsenal 386, which was in Fu Jian province. Those came later. The Arsenal 416 guns are the early ones. If we look at the serial number here, this tells us a lot about the gun, actually. 85F means that this is a 1985 production gun. It is a folding stock model. It is in caliber 7.62, and the actual sequential serial number is 684. So the whole thing together is the official legal serial number, but there's a bunch of information encoded into it there. A lot of people like to deride Chinese manufacturing quality, but the Polytech and also the early Norinco AKs were actually excellent, very high quality rifles. These were being made by the same factories that made Chinese military rifles. These were not, they weren't scrimping and cutting corners for the civilian market. They were basically just taking the exact military production, modifying it as legally required to be semi-automatic only and importable into the US, and shipping that. So these are high quality, very reliable guns, and today they're considered much better than a lot of the imports that would follow during the assault weapon ban era from countries like Romania and others. The glory days of importation of rifles like the Polytech AKs, and also many of the Norinco AKs, would only last until 1989 when the US, the Bush administration, passed an importation ban on rifles like this. So we see just a few years of this, and the other thing that would happen is with the popularity of rifles like the Polytech AKS and the Polytech Legend, everybody in the market started realizing that, hey, there's a lot of opportunity for semi-auto AKs in the US. And so there was a profusion of new options that became available. And under the new restrictions of the '89 import ban and then the 1994 assault weapons ban, you would see a wide variety of, well, what would be called at that point post-ban, post-1994 configuration AK rifles. And they would start coming in from all over the place. You'd see them from Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, China, of course, and out of Russia. So this is kind of one of the granddaddies of the semi-auto AK in the US, and I thought it would be pretty cool to take a look at this one. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.